함이 쓰시는지 월매라니까.
I just discovered why medieval knights had stronger bones, better digestion, and more energy than modern athletes, and it has nothing to do with their training. It's because of one forgotten grain that's sitting in ancient recipe books, laughing at our wheat obsession. But here's the terrifying part. You know what's funny about medieval times? While we're over here obsessing about gluten-free this and organic that, people back then were munching on a grain that puts our precious wheat to shame. And nobody grows it anymore. Meet barley, the medieval superstar that basically ran Europe for centuries. This wasn't just some backup grain people settled for when times got tough. Nope. Barley was the main event, the headliner, the grain equivalent of a Swiss Army knife that could handle absolutely everything. Here's where it gets interesting. While wheat throws a tantrum if the weather isn't perfect, too cold, too wet, too dry, whatever, barley just shrugs and keeps growing. Think of wheat as that high-maintenance friend who needs everything just right, while barley is the buddy who shows up ready for anything. Rain, shine, terrible soil, barley's got you covered. The medieval folks weren't stupid. They figured out that barley could fill bellies, fuel their legendary ale drinking sessions, and even feed their livestock. Talk about multitasking. One grain, endless possibilities. Makes you wonder why we abandoned something so reliable, right? But here's the catch, and there's always a catch. Barley bread wasn't exactly what you'd call fluffy. Remember those Instagram-worthy sourdough loaves everyone was making during lockdown? Yeah, barley bread was the complete opposite. Dense, chewy, and about as light as a medieval knight's armor. The problem was gluten, or rather, the lack of it. Barley has some gluten, but not nearly enough to create those airy, pillowy loaves we've grown accustomed to. Medieval bakers worked with what they had, though. They mixed barley with whatever wheat they could get their hands on, creating bread that was more about survival than Instagram likes. Well, here's something that'll blow your mind. We've been growing barley for over 10,000 years. 10,000. That's older than agriculture itself in most places. While our ancestors were still figuring out how to plant seeds in rows, barley was already proving itself as the reliable grain that never let anyone down. The medieval period was basically barley's golden age. Everyone from peasants to kings depended on it. Harvest festivals celebrated it. Entire economies revolved around it. And the beer? Don't even get me started on medieval ale. Barley made those legendary drinking sessions possible. Fast forward to today, and barley's been pushed to the sidelines like yesterday's news. Modern milling techniques favor wheat. Consumer preferences lean toward soft, white bread. Barley got left behind in our rush toward convenience and uniformity. The weird part is, nutritionally speaking, barley kicks wheat's behind in almost every category. But taste and texture won the battle, and barley lost the war. Then there's another grain that took a completely different approach to medieval survival. While barley ruled the medieval grain game, there was another tough customer quietly dominating the coldest corners of Europe. Oats didn't need fancy soil or perfect weather conditions. This grain was like that reliable old uncle who shows up to every family gathering regardless of the weather forecast. In Scotland and Scandinavia, where winter feels like it lasts 9 months and summer is just a rumor, oats became the backbone of survival. The Scots turned oat cultivation into an art form. They made porridge so thick you could practically stand a spoon in it, and oat cakes that could double as building materials if needed. But here's where it gets interesting. Oats weren't just tough. They were nutritionally superior to almost everything else growing in medieval fields. Packed with protein, fiber, and healthy fats, they kept people energized through brutal Nordic winters. Makes sense why Scottish warriors could march for miles on nothing but oat porridge, right? The Romans, however, had different opinions. They considered oats horse food and mocked anyone eating them. Fast forward 1,000 years, and the famous English writer Samuel Johnson couldn't resist taking a jab at the Scots, defining oats in his dictionary as a grain which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people. The Scots reportedly fired back with something like, "That's why England has the best horses and Scotland has the best men." Well, turns out the Scots were onto something revolutionary. Oats contain a special type of fiber called beta-glucan that actually helps lower cholesterol. Medieval Scottish farmers accidentally created one of history's first superfoods without even knowing it. Unlike wheat, Oats didn't need perfect growing conditions. They thrived in cool, wet climates where other grains would rot in the ground. Farmers could plant them in spring and harvest a reliable crop by late summer, even in terrible soil that wouldn't support barley. The weird part is how oats handled processing. Most grains need their hulls removed, but oats required a special technique called kilning, essentially roasting them to make the hulls easier to remove. This extra step actually improved their flavor and shelf life. But why did oats fade from our dinner tables? Simple. They couldn't make fluffy bread. While oats excel at porridge, cakes, and hearty meals, they lack the gluten structure needed for those light, airy loaves that became fashionable. As wheat production improved and became cheaper, oats got relegated to breakfast bowls and horse feed. Today, we're rediscovering what medieval Scots knew all along. Oats are nutritional powerhouses that grow where other crops fail. Yet, there's another grain that makes oats look pampered, one that thrived in the harshest conditions imaginable and fed entire civilizations when everything else failed. Picture medieval farmers scratching their heads at rocky, frozen soil that wouldn't grow a dandelion, let alone wheat. Enter rye, the grain equivalent of that friend who thrives in chaos while everyone else is having a meltdown. This hardy little survivor practically laughed at poor soil conditions and harsh winters that made other grains wave the white flag. Rye was basically the Chuck Norris of medieval grains. Cold weather? No problem. Nutrient-poor dirt that looked like concrete? Bring it on. While wheat was being picky about perfect growing conditions like a spoiled celebrity demanding only green M&Ms, rye rolled up its sleeves and got to work. The bread that came from rye was nothing like the fluffy white loaves we grab at the grocery store today. We're talking dense, dark, and packed tighter than a subway car during rush hour. It had the texture of a brick and roughly the same weight. But here's the thing. That dense brick was loaded with nutrients and kept people alive when wheat crops failed. Northern and Eastern European farmers knew rye's secret. This grain could grow where wheat wouldn't even attempt to sprout. Russia, Poland, Germany, they all became rye superpowers because their climate was basically rye's favorite vacation spot: cold, harsh, and unforgiving. Perfect. Then there's the cost factor. Rye was the budget-friendly option of medieval agriculture. While wealthy folks might splurge on wheat bread for Sunday dinner, regular families relied on rye to keep their bellies full without breaking the bank. It was like choosing the reliable used car over the fancy sports car. Not as flashy, but it got the job done. But rye had its quirks. Grinding, it was tougher than explaining social media to your grandmother. The dense grain fought back against medieval milling equipment, making flour production more labor-intensive. Bakers had to adjust their techniques because rye dough behaved differently than wheat. Less gluten meant less rise, resulting in those famously dense loaves. Ancient Romans actually knew about rye's potential thousands of years before medieval times, though they mostly treated it as a backup plan. Smart move considering how many civilizations later depended on it for survival. What's fascinating is how rye's decline mirrors our changing relationship with food. As white, fluffy bread became the status symbol, rye got pushed to the sidelines like last season's fashion trend. We traded durability and nutrition for appearance and texture. Modern agriculture favored high-yield crops that were easier to process, and rye couldn't compete with wheat's convenience factor. The irony: today's health-conscious consumers are rediscovering what medieval peasants knew all along. Sometimes the tougher choice is actually the better choice. But rye wasn't the only grain playing hard to get with medieval farmers. Here's something that'll blow your mind about medieval dining habits. While everyone obsesses over wheat and barley, there was this scrappy little grain quietly feeding entire communities without anyone giving it proper credit. Meet millet, the grain equivalent of that reliable friend who shows up every time you move apartments but never gets invited to the fancy dinner parties. Millet had one superpower that made medieval farmers absolutely love it. This stuff could grow anywhere. Seriously, anywhere. Poor soil? No problem. Blazing heat? Bring it on. Drought conditions that would make other crops wave their white flags? Millet just shrugged and kept growing. It was like the Chuck Norris of grains, except it actually existed and fed people. The speed of this grain was honestly ridiculous. While wheat sat around taking its sweet time, millet could go from seed to harvest in just 60 to 90 days. That's faster than most people can stick to a diet plan. This quick turnaround meant farmers could squeeze in extra harvests when times got tough, which happened more often than a medieval peasant would have liked. But here's where things get interesting. Millet didn't taste like wheat or barley. It had this mild, slightly nutty flavor that some folks describe as earthy. Medieval cooks turned it into flatbreads that were dense and filling, plus porridges that stuck to your ribs better than medieval armor. The texture was different too, chewier, grittier, more substantial. Think of it as the difference between a firm handshake and a limp fish greeting. Now, medieval Europeans weren't the biggest millet fans compared to other regions. While they were fussing over their wheat and barley, people in Asia and Africa were absolutely crushing it with millet-based meals. Smart move, honestly. This grain packed serious nutritional punch. Protein, fiber, minerals that kept people healthy when scurvy was still a legitimate concern. The weird part is how millet completely vanished from most Western tables. Today, 97 million people worldwide still depend on this grain, but ask your average grocery shopper about millet and they'll probably think you're talking about bird food, which is hilarious because we're literally feeding our pets better ancient grains than we eat ourselves. Medieval communities used millet as their insurance policy. Bad harvest year? Millet's got your back. Other crops failing because the weather decided to throw a tantrum? Millet's still standing there, ready to feed families. It was the ultimate backup plan that rarely needed to be a backup. This reliability came with trade-offs, though. Millet bread wasn't winning any fluffiness contests, and the flavor took some getting used to, but when your alternative was potentially starving, these seemed like pretty minor complaints. Speaking of grains that got overlooked despite being absolutely incredible, there's one that fooled people for centuries into thinking it was just fancy wheat. Meet Spelt, the grain that's been fooling people for centuries. At first glance, you'd swear it was wheat's twin brother. But bite into a piece of spelt bread and your taste buds get hit with something completely different. A rich, nutty flavor that makes regular wheat taste like cardboard by comparison. Medieval farmers loved this stuff, and not just because it tasted better. Spelt was like that reliable friend who shows up when everyone else bails. Poor soil? No problem. Harsh weather? Bring it on. While wheat would throw a tantrum and refuse to grow, Spelt just shrugged and kept producing grain. The nutritional profile reads like a health food store advertisement. More protein than wheat? Check. Higher fiber content? Absolutely. Better mineral content? You bet. Medieval folks didn't know about vitamins and minerals, but they knew Spelt kept them feeling stronger and more satisfied than other grains. Here's where it gets interesting, though. Spelt bread wasn't your everyday peasant food. It was more like the medieval equivalent of artisanal sourdough. Dense, flavorful, and substantial enough that one slice could keep you going for hours. Think of it as the difference between a cheap hamburger bun and a thick slice of bakery bread that actually has some backbone to it. But Spelt had one major flaw that would eventually doom it. Processing this grain was about as enjoyable as trying to crack walnuts with your bare hands. The hulls clung to the grain like a toddler clings to their favorite toy. Removing them required extra time, extra labor, and extra equipment. When you're running a medieval farm and every minute counts, that extra work starts adding up faster than compound interest. The ancient Romans were absolutely crazy about Spelt. They used it in religious ceremonies, considering it sacred enough to offer to their gods. Makes you wonder what Jupiter would think about our modern wonder bread, doesn't it? Roman soldiers marched across Europe fueled by spelt porridge, probably wondering why anyone would bother with inferior grains. Then something fascinating happened. As wheat became easier to process and mill, spelt got pushed aside like last season's fashion. But here's the twist. We're living through a spelt renaissance right now. Health-conscious folks are rediscovering what medieval people knew all along. This grain delivers nutrition and flavor that puts modern wheat to shame. Artisan bakers are going nuts for spelt these days, charging premium prices for what used to be common medieval fare. The irony is thick enough to cut with a knife. Well, if you think spelt's story is remarkable, wait until you hear about Emmer. This ancient grain didn't just feed people, it literally built civilizations from the ground up. Meet Emmer, the grain that basically built civilization, then got fired for being too much work. This ancient wheat. Cousin was one of humanity's first agricultural success stories. We're talking 10,000 years of service here, folks. While your neighbors were still hunting mammoth steaks, early farmers were already perfecting emmer cultivation in the Fertile Crescent. Talk about getting in on the ground floor of agriculture. What made emmer so special? Simple. It was tougher than a $2 steak and twice as reliable. This grain could handle weather that would make modern wheat curl up and cry. Drought, poor soil, temperature swings that would give other crops whiplash. Emmer just shrugged and kept growing. Medieval farmers loved this about it because, frankly, they had enough problems without their food supply throwing tantrums. The taste wasn't shabby either. Emmer delivered a nutty, complex flavor that made regular wheat taste like cardboard in comparison. Medieval bakers used it for everything from dense, chewy breads to hearty porridges that could stick to your ribs for hours. Think of it as the original superfood, except nobody called it that because marketing hadn't been invented yet. But here's where things get interesting and slightly tragic. Emmer came wrapped in what's called a tough hull. Picture trying to crack walnuts, except smaller, and you need to do thousands of them just to make dinner. Every single grain required serious elbow grease to remove its protective coating. Medieval folks had time for this kind of thing, but as society got busier and lazier, emmer started looking less attractive. The real nail in the coffin came when easier to process wheat varieties showed up. Why spend half your day hulling emmer when you could process wheat in a fraction of the time? It was like choosing between a horse-drawn cart and a Ferrari. Sure, the cart had character, but the Ferrari got you there faster. Ancient Egyptians and Mesopotamians built entire civilizations on emmer's reliable shoulders. Egyptian pharaohs were buried with stores of it, probably figuring they'd need good bread in the afterlife too. Can't blame them for thinking ahead. Here's the twist that would make any marketing executive weep. We tossed aside this nutritional powerhouse for convenience. Emmer packs more protein and fiber than modern wheat, plus minerals that could make your doctor do a happy dance. But nobody cared about nutrition labels when they were busy not starving. Today, fancy restaurants and health-conscious bakers are rediscovering emmer like it's some exotic treasure. Chefs charge premium prices for what medieval peasants ate daily. The irony is thicker than emmer porridge. What's fascinating is how this story keeps repeating itself throughout grain history. But wait until you hear about Einkorn. The grain's so ancient, it makes emmer look like yesterday's news. Meet Einkorn, the great-great-great-grandfather of every piece of bread you've ever eaten. This little grain started the whole wheat revolution about 10,000 years. Ego, and frankly, it's got more personality than most people I know. Here's the wild part. Einkorn was humanity's first attempt at farming wheat. Our ancestors looked at this wild grass growing in the hills of Turkey and thought, you know what? Let's tame this thing. They had no idea they were launching an agricultural empire that would feed billions. Talk about beginner's luck. What makes Einkorn special isn't just its age. Though being the original wheat is pretty impressive, this grain has only 14 chromosomes, while modern wheat has 42. That's like comparing a flip phone to a smartphone. Simple? Yes, but sometimes simple works better. The taste hits you differently too. Where modern wheat can be bland as cardboard, Einkorn delivers this sweet, nutty flavor that makes you wonder what we've been doing wrong all these years. It's like tasting bread for the first time, which technically our ancestors were. But here's where things get interesting from a health perspective. Those 14 chromosomes mean fewer gluten proteins. Not gluten-free, mind you, let's not get crazy, but definitely easier on sensitive stomachs. Some folks who can't handle regular wheat find Einkorn surprisingly agreeable. Makes sense, right? We evolved eating this stuff for thousands of years. Medieval farmers knew Einkorn well, especially in mountainous regions where other grains threw tantrums. It grew on rocky slopes and poor soil like a champ. The hulls were tough as old leather, protecting the grain inside better than any modern packaging. And the weird part is how we abandoned it. As agriculture got more sophisticated, farmers wanted higher yields. Einkorn produces about half what modern wheat does per acre. In a world obsessed with efficiency, that's basically a death sentence. We traded flavor and nutrition for volume, the agricultural equivalent of choosing quantity over quality at a buffet. Processing Einkorn was no joke either. Those protective hulls that made it so resilient, they were murder to remove. Picture trying to unwrap a present where someone used industrial-strength tape. Eventually, easier grains won out simply because nobody wanted to spend all day hulling their breakfast. Today, Einkorn is making a comeback among artisan bakers and health nuts who appreciate its ancient credentials. These folks mill it fresh, bake with it lovingly, and charge premium prices for the privilege. It's like vintage wine. Technically older and arguably better, but definitely more expensive. The irony isn't lost on me. We spent thousands of years improving wheat, making it bigger, fluffier, and more productive. Now we're paying extra to go backward to where we started. Sometimes progress means remembering what we left behind.